This week's parasha is Parashat Shofetim. I'd like to talk about one mitzvah that caught my attention in the parasha. In the section on the appointment of a king, the Torah writes, "V'haya cheshivto al kisei mamlachto v'chatav lo et mishnei haTorah hazot al sefer milifnei hakohanim haleviim." When he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself this Mishnei Torah, I'll leave that untranslated for a minute, in a scroll before the Kohanim, the Leviim. והייתה עמו, וקרא בו כל ימי חייו, למען ילמד וירא את אדוני אלוהיו, לשמוע את כל דברי התורה הזאת, ואת החוקים האלה לעשותם. And it shall be with him, and he shall read in it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to fear God, to keep all the words of this Torah and these laws to do them. לבלתי ירום לבבו מאחיו, לבלתי סור מן המצווה ימין ושמאל, למען יאריך ימים על ממלכתו, הוא ובניו בקרב ישראל. So that his heart will not be lifted up above his brothers, he will not turn aside to the right or the left, so that he will prolong his days in his kingdom, he and his descendants among Israel. Now, the phrase Mishnei Torah, it later became used as a name for Sefer Devarim as a whole, and via the Greek translation, Deuteronomion, it's the origin of the English name, Deuteronomy. But in the context of this halakha, Mishnei Torah appears to mean a copy of the whole Torah. And this is how Chazal explains it and how the Rambam codifies it in his Mishnei Torah. In Hilchot Sefer Torah, he lists two separate mitzvot that involve writing a Sefer Torah. Mitzvat aseh al kol ish ve'ish miYisrael lichtov Sefer Torah le'atzmo. It is a positive commandment for every Jewish man to write a Torah scroll for himself. And after that, HaMelech mesuveh lichtov Sefer Torah le'acher le'atzmo l'shem HaMelech yeter Sefer shehaya lo kshuv hediot. The king is commanded to write another Torah scroll for himself as king, in addition to the scroll which he possessed while a commoner. So why is it so important for the king to write his own Sefer Torah and to write it while he is king, even if he already has a Sefer Torah? I want to suggest an answer based on some characteristic features of the institution of kingship. Kingship is located at a point of tension between opposing concepts. When the mitzvah to appoint a king was put into practice for the first time, and we read in Sefer Shmuel that Shmuel the Navi was commanded by HaKadosh Baruch Hu to anoint Shaul as king, but immediately after doing so, he severely rebuked the people. He said, "Radchem rabbah, asher asitem be'enei Adonai lishol lachem melech." Your wickedness is great, which you have done in God's sight by asking for a king. On the one hand, the country needed a strong leader, a leader who would unite the people and fight against the Philistines, the leading military force at the time. But on the other hand, by appointing an individual human as king, the people appeared to be rebelling against the one true king, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who took us out of Egypt. And if we look at the meaning of being a king for the nations around us in biblical times and many centuries after, we can see this tension very clearly. In Egypt, the Pharaoh was considered a god. He was son of Ra, incarnation of Horus. In the time of Chazal, the Roman emperors were worshipped as gods, certainly after they died and sometimes even during their lifetimes. If you look at the names of the last 4 months in English, which are derived from their Latin names, May is named after a goddess, Maya. June is named after a goddess, Juno. And then July is named after Julius Caesar, and this month, August, is named after Augustus Caesar. And Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar both had temples dedicated to them in the hearts of Rome. And you can still see this. You can still see this to some extent today. Perhaps not the time to go into details, but you could see traces of the concept of king as god in King Charles's coronation ceremony that took place a few months ago. What is more, the king was personally above the law, which is still true today in many countries. You can't sue the King of Spain. You can't take the Queen of Denmark to court. They're not answerable for their actions. But in the Torah, this is not the case. The king is subject to the Torah. Although the Mishnah in Sanhedrin says, "Hamelech lo dan v'lo daninoto," the king does not judge and is not judged. This is only a gezerah, it's a rabbinic ordinance applied to the kings of the Second Temple period because they showed themselves as lacking humility and integrity. The kings of Beit David, according to Torah law, could be brought to Beit Din like anybody else, and they were subject to legal penalties like anyone else. So, in this context, the mitzvah of the king to write a Sefer Torah goes along with the mitzvot that limit him from excessive pomp and circumstances. He's not allowed to have huge numbers of wives or huge numbers of horses in order to convey to him that in spite of his elevated position, as a person he's no different than any other Jew and certainly not a god. His heart should not be lifted up from his brothers. Every Jew is required to write his own Sefer Torah, and on his accession the king is sent straight back to school to write the second Sefer Torah. Writing is something we don't do so much today. If we see something that interests us, something we want to remember, we might copy and paste it on the computer, we might take a photo with our phones. But a few generations ago, people would copy things out by hand if they wanted to remember them. I think this is a practice we could gain a lot by adopting. I think if we tried copying out a few psukim from Tehillim or Ma'amar Chazal every day, we would find it was very effective at internalizing them and making them part of our consciousness. The Chidah, Chacham Chaim Yosef David Azulai, comments on the Baraita Masechet Avot. Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, בכל יום ויום בת קול יוצאת מהחורב ואומרת, אוי להם לבריות מעלבונה של תורה. שכל מי שאינו עוסק בתורה נקרא נזוף. Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi said that every day a voice comes from Mount Chorev and says, woe unto people for the insult of the Torah, since anyone who does not occupy himself with Torah is considered to be reprimanded. So the Chidah asks, why should the Torah be insulted if one person is not studying it? Aren't there enough people studying Torah? And he answers that every individual has their own individual portion of Torah that they receive from Sinai. Kol Adam Yisrael kibel chelko miSinai. And this cannot be brought to light by anyone but them. Going back to the king, there's a remarkable statement in the Talmud Yerushalmi on the verse we just read, V'kara bo kol yimei chayav, he shall read it all the days of his life. והרי דברים קל וחומר, מה עם מלך ישראל שהיה עסוק בצורכי ישראל, נאמר בו וקרא בו כל ימי חייו, ההדיוט על אחת כמה וכמה. This is not a kal v'chomer. If it says of the king of Israel, who is concerned with the affairs of Israel, he shall read it all the days of his life, all the more so a private individual. At first sight, I thought this kal v'chomer was the wrong way round. I would have thought a commoner has less need to read the Torah every day than the king who is concerned with the affairs of Israel. But perhaps this is the flip side of the requirement for the king to see himself as no better than his fellow Jews. Equally, although we are only private individuals and occupied with our private affairs, we should see ourselves as no less important in the scale of things than the king of Israel, who is occupied with affairs of state on a daily basis. And we should attempt to occupy ourselves with bringing to light our own unique contribution to the Torah. Shabbat Shalom.